At dawn, a man noticed fire trucks racing toward his land where a scheduled firefighter training was about to occur. To his shock, Karen had set up a campsite right in the middle of the training ground overnight. She refused to leave, claiming she had rented the land through a Craigslist ad. Despite warnings from the fire chief and landowner, Karen live-streamed the confrontation and caused massive delays. Her stubbornness turned a critical emergency drill into complete chaos. How did such an unbelievable scene unfold at the break of dawn? Join us as we dive into the full story that took absurdity to a whole new level. At exactly 5:30 a.m., just when the sky barely hinted at the first flush of morning light, the serenity of the countryside shattered under the wail of sirens slicing through the darkness like an industrial saw blade. I stumbled groggily onto my porch, half-dressed, coffee mug slipping precariously from my fingers, blinking in disbelief as 5 fully loaded fire trucks barreled down my private dirt road, throwing towering clouds of dust into the cool morning air. I could feel my heart stutter against my ribs, not from the sight of the trucks themselves, but from the direction they hurtled toward, my back acreage, the very field meticulously prepared for the fire department's live fire training exercise. As they screeched to a halt, headlights slicing across the landscape in stark, unforgiving beams, my stomach dropped. Center stage, right where the first simulated fire was supposed to ignite, stood the most absurd sight imaginable. A bright pink camping tent surrounded by tiki torches, a folding breakfast table neatly set with plates and cutlery, and, most surreal of all, a woman clad in a leopard print bathrobe cheerfully roasting marshmallows over a tiny fire pit, looking utterly at home in the chaos she had unknowingly stepped into. For a long, stretched second, nobody moved. The firefighters exchanged bewildered glances, their faces half-shadowed and half-illuminated by the truck beams. I just stood there on the porch slack-jawed, wondering if perhaps I had not woken up at all, and this was some deranged fever dream. It was Karen, of course it was Karen. She turned her head lazily, blew a smoke ring from her marshmallow stick straight into the smoky dawn air, and shouted with the entitlement of royalty that the trucks were blocking her sunrise view. The day before had been eerily quiet, suspiciously so. I had walked the perimeter of the property myself in the afternoon, checking every inch of ground to ensure it was clear and ready. Not a footprint, not a single tire track disturbed the dusty soil. Yet somehow, overnight, Karen had materialized like a campsite fairy godmother, except infinitely louder, much more chaotic, and about as welcome as a family of skunks at a wedding reception. When I rushed down to the scene, still barefoot, Karen was already locked in a heated argument with the fire chief, her hands planted firmly on her hips, sunglasses slipping down her nose as she jabbed her finger toward the trucks, screeching about her rights. Her voice cut through the morning like a blade, high-pitched and relentless, throwing around words like squatters' rights and public land as if sheer volume alone could turn fantasy into reality. The chief, a grizzled veteran who had once stared down a burning meth lab without blinking, looked about 2 seconds away from radioing in for air support. I quickly stepped between them, trying to defuse the situation by introducing myself as the actual owner of the property. Karen scoffed with a derisive snort, yanked a crumpled piece of paper from her leopard print tote bag, and waved it under my nose like it was the Magna Carta. She had rented the property, she declared triumphantly, flashing a printed Craigslist ad featuring a blurry, generic photo that could have been snapped anywhere within 3 states and a hastily typed description offering a private camping retreat for $50 a night with no questions asked. I glanced at the paper, feeling a headache begin to brew behind my eyes. There was no address, no coordinates, no owner's name, not even a phone number beyond a disposable burner. Karen had been scammed, plain and simple, but that fact seemed irrelevant to her as she dug in her heels deeper. I explained gently that she had been tricked, that she was trespassing on private land, and that in less than 20 minutes the entire area would be engulfed in controlled flames and smoke. Karen's response was to smirk like she had just trapped a grandmaster in a chess match. She sneered that I better cancel my little play date because she was not moving an inch. She had rights. She was not going to be bullied. The fire chief pulled me aside, his jaw clenched so tight I thought he might grind his molars into powder. "We cannot delay," he said. "The trainees are already en route. There are 3 departments coordinating today. If we miss the window, the whole operation collapses." I nodded grimly, feeling the heavy weight of the situation settle in my chest. Karen was not just an annoying squatter. She was now a major threat to critical emergency service preparation that could ultimately cost lives when the real fires came. I tried one last time, offering to help her pack up, even offering to call a tow service at my own expense, but she refused with the stubbornness of a mountain goat. Recording every word on her phone and broadcasting a live stream titled "Save Karen's Can't Stop the Tyranny." Behind me, the firefighters fidgeted anxiously, needing to deploy simulated house frames, lay out hoses, and begin burning drills. Every minute wasted was a minute of training lost, city resources flushed down the drain, and an increased risk that something might go catastrophically wrong. Karen plopped into a folding lawn chair, cracked open a soda, and dramatically ignored all of us. The fire chief's face darkened like a brewing thunderstorm. Then Karen made her most catastrophic move yet. She dialed 911, putting it on speaker, shrieking hysterically that she was under violent siege by rogue firemen. The dispatcher, clearly already briefed about the scheduled training, calmly explained she was trespassing and the fire department was operating lawfully. Karen was beyond reasoning, yelling about lawsuits, damages, wrongful eviction, and the cost of trauma therapy she would now need. The chief finally snapped. He barked orders and his crews began setting up despite Karen's protests. Metal frames went up just yards from her pink tent, hoses were laid, smoke machines hissed out thick, rolling clouds of artificial smoke. The transformation on Karen's face was instant, from smug satisfaction to wide-eyed horror. She leapt up, waving her arms, shouting that she would sue every last one of us, that we were destroying her sacred spiritual retreat. The firefighters marched on, oblivious to her tantrum, focused solely on the critical mission ahead. As the first controlled flames danced to life on the far side of the field, casting an ominous orange glow over her campsite, the brutal reality finally sunk in for Karen. She was not a queen, not a victim, not even a camper. She was an illegal trespasser standing in the middle of a fully authorized live fire simulation. I stood silently beside the chief, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold and whispered just loud enough for him to hear that this was only the warm-up. The thudding of heavy boots, the metallic clatter of gear, the sharp commands over radios filled the air as the firefighting teams swung into action. Karen, realizing the rising tide of inevitability against her, began pacing frantically in front of her tent, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline, live streaming every move like she was reporting on a war zone. The fire chief, visibly struggling to maintain professional composure, began coordinating with his teams to work around her. Smoke began to blanket the field in thick sheets, visibility dropped, and yet Karen, like a moth too stubborn to flee a flame, remained rooted in place, raving to her audience about tyranny and oppression. 10 more minutes, the chief growled at me. 10 minutes, then we proceed with full drills, no exceptions. I could feel the heavy inevitability crackling in the smoky morning air, an unstoppable force about to meet an immovable object, and somewhere deep inside, I almost felt a flicker of pity for Karen. Almost. The fallout from that chaotic morning did not take long to ignite. Within just 48 hours, a thick manila envelope showed up on my doorstep, and when I opened it, my heart sank into my shoes. Karen had filed a lawsuit against me, against the fire department, against the city, and for good measure, against the unknown officers of the state who had apparently conspired to trample her sacred camping rights. The complaint read like it had been written during a fever dream: claims of intentional infliction of emotional distress, violation of camping liberties, destruction of personal property without due process, and my personal favorite, spiritual vandalism of a sacred retreat. I could not decide whether to laugh or start stress eating the entire contents of my fridge. Knowing better than to try handling this mess on my own, I immediately drove the whole stack of crazy over to Lisa, my attorney, a woman so sharp she could cut glass with her tone alone. Lisa flipped through the pages without so much as raising an eyebrow, finally slapping the last page closed with a soft thud and stating with absolute conviction that this was the dumbest legal filing she had seen in 6 months. And that was saying something considering the kind of nonsense she usually dealt with. Without missing a beat, she launched into action, gathering every piece of evidence we could muster. I provided her with security camera footage from the barn, crystal clear clips showing Karen dragging her folding table and pink tent onto the field in the dead of night like some suburban outlaw on a secret mission. The fire department came through with signed copies of their authorization papers and the official training schedule, meticulously documented and timestamped. Several firefighters, still seething over the sheer stupidity of the situation, volunteered to submit written statements detailing how Karen's antics had derailed an entire morning of critical life-saving training. But it was not just the direct evidence that painted Karen into a corner. Lisa, with the gleam of a predator scenting blood, began digging deeper, reaching out to contacts in legal databases and property owner forums. It turned out Karen was not just a one-time offender. No, Karen had a history, a well-documented, multi-state, bona fide career in professional victimhood. She had pulled almost identical stunts across at least 3 different states, always the same pattern: find a remote patch of land, set up camp without permission, and when inevitably discovered, cry foul, threaten legal action, and often collect a small settlement just to make her go away. Sometimes she would vanish without much of a fight, but more often she tied up small-town property owners and volunteer departments in endless nuisance lawsuits that drained their money and patience. Armed with this bombshell, Lisa wasted no time counterfiling a motion to dismiss Karen's lawsuit entirely and, even better, slapped a counterclaim on her for malicious prosecution, trespassing, interference with emergency services, and fraud. The fire department, furious that their critical wildfire training had been jeopardized by a lone lunatic with a tiki torch, filed their own legal action too, seeking damages for the costs of rescheduling, overtime, and the disruption of interdepartmental coordination. Suddenly, Karen's confident march toward courtroom glory hit a wall of brick and rebar. Her lawyer, realizing he had hitched his wagon to a runaway dumpster fire, tried frantically to negotiate a quick settlement. He floated the idea that if we just paid Karen a few $1,000s, she would quietly disappear and we could all move on. Lisa, not missing a beat, shut it down with a single icy statement that she would see him and his client buried under paperwork before a single dime left our pockets. She was not just playing defense anymore. She was hunting. Meanwhile, word about the incident spread like dry brush catching fire. Local news outlets caught wind of the story and ran with it, publishing headlines like "Woman tries to camp at fire training site, sues firefighters for doing their job." Social media had an absolute field day. Memes popped up showing a cartoon Karen in a fire helmet, yelling into a walkie-talkie as flames raged behind her. Somebody even created a fake GoFundMe campaign titled "Save Karen's Marshmallows," which racked up thousands of mocking comments within hours. It was not just the town laughing. It was the entire county, maybe even the state. Firefighters from neighboring departments began jokingly referring to their training areas as Karen's retreats. And an unofficial challenge started where crews tried to outdo each other by creating the funniest fake Karen camping zones complete with makeshift tents and marshmallow roasting stations. But beneath the public mockery, there was a real and serious consequence. Karen's antics had risked the readiness of an entire region's emergency response force. Wildfire season was around the corner, and the delayed drills meant some trainees were behind schedule learning critical containment techniques. It was not just an inconvenience. It was an outright threat to public safety, and the city knew it. That knowledge made everyone twice as determined to ensure Karen faced real consequences for once instead of slipping away under a cloud of self-righteous indignation. Karen, sensing the tide turning sharply against her, retreated from public view. Her once busy social media accounts, previously filled with videos of her ranting about injustice and tyranny, went dark almost overnight. Her lawyer stopped answering emails promptly. It became clear that the original plan, to bully and shame her way into a settlement, had backfired so spectacularly that even her own representation wanted off the sinking ship. Then came the news we had all been waiting for. The court scheduled an initial hearing date to hear the motions for dismissal and the counterclaims. Lisa warned me that although Karen had lost every advantage, cornered people sometimes made desperate moves, and it would not surprise her if Karen tried some last-minute stunt to stall or derail the process. I could only nod grimly. After everything that had happened, the lies, the disruption, the sheer entitled arrogance, it was almost poetic that Karen, who had spent years weaponizing victimhood for personal gain, was now about to face a courtroom packed with evidence, witnesses, and hard consequences. Driving past the training field one evening, I noticed that the firefighters had erected a brand new wooden sign on the edge of the property. It was handmade, rough and simple, but the message was unmistakable. Karen's retreat was painted in large letters across the top, and beneath it, a cartoonish image of a pink tent going up in flames while a tiny figure in leopard print ran screaming from the scene. It was childish. It was petty. And it was absolutely perfect. I laughed so hard I had to pull over on the shoulder, wiping tears from my eyes, the kind of laughter that comes not from mockery but from the pure, cathartic relief of knowing that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe gets it exactly right. The courtroom buzzed with a low hum of anticipation as people filed into the wooden pews, clutching coffee cups, shuffling papers, and exchanging knowing looks. It was not every day a case this ridiculous landed on the local docket, and word had spread fast through the town. Reporters huddled near the front, notepads poised, their eyes gleaming with the promise of headline gold. A few off-duty firefighters sat quietly along the back wall, their uniforms crisp and freshly pressed, faces serious, but barely able to hide the amusement sparking behind their eyes. I sat near the front with Lisa beside me, her posture perfectly composed, her sharp gaze locked forward with the intensity of a hawk circling over an open field, ready to swoop the moment weakness showed itself. When Karen entered the courtroom, there was a subtle ripple of reaction, a few stifled gasps from people who had not seen her up close before. Gone was the leopard print robe and chaotic bravado. Instead, she wore a drab gray suit, several sizes too big for her frame, as if she had borrowed it from someone else, hoping to project an image of somber humility. She even affected a slight limp, clutching dramatically at her lawyer's arm as they shuffled toward the plaintiff's table, trying to sell the image of a wounded, wronged citizen barely surviving the horrors inflicted upon her by a band of heartless firemen and a greedy landowner. The judge entered without fanfare, a stern woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper reputation for having zero patience for courtroom theatrics. She called the room to order with a single authoritative bang of her gavel and motioned for the plaintiff to begin. Karen's lawyer rose with an air of solemnity, launching into a drawn-out saga painting Karen as an innocent woman, peacefully minding her business on what she believed to be public land, only to be terrorized, assaulted, and emotionally shattered by the ruthless actions of trained emergency personnel and a callous property owner. He peppered his speech with all the right buzzwords: constitutional rights, undue force, fragile mental health, and devastating loss of property. At one point, he even held up photographs of Karen's soggy pink tent, her broken marshmallow sticks, and her collapsed lawn chair as exhibits of the profound suffering she had endured. I half expected him to pull out a violin and start playing a sad tune. Lisa remained perfectly still until it was our turn to speak. When she stood, the entire atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. She opened a thick binder with a soft but deliberate snap and began presenting our side with icy precision. First, Lisa walked the court through a meticulous timeline of events backed by security camera footage, eyewitness testimony, and the official authorization paperwork signed by the city for the fire department's training session. Each document was time-stamped, notarized, and beyond dispute. She presented the Craigslist ad Karen had fallen for, pointing out the obvious scam indicators. No address, no coordinates, no contact names, no verifiable information at all. Then, without raising her voice or losing her composure, Lisa dropped the bombshell that sent a visible shudder through Karen's side of the courtroom. She presented Karen's history of pulling nearly identical stunts in multiple states, detailing how she would trespass, fabricate outrage, and weaponize the legal system to extract settlements from overwhelmed property owners and small departments. As Lisa spoke, the judge's eyebrows arched noticeably higher with every revelation, her pen flying across her notepad. Karen's lawyer objected, arguing that prior incidents were irrelevant and prejudicial. The judge barely glanced up before overruling him firmly, stating that a clear pattern of behavior was very much relevant in evaluating the credibility of the plaintiff. From that moment on, it was as if the air had been sucked out of Karen's side of the room. Karen herself shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her previously wounded expression starting to crumble under the harsh spotlight of reality. She leaned toward her lawyer, whispering furiously, but he looked like a man who desperately wanted to be anywhere else. It only got worse when the fire chief took the stand, his voice calm, steady, and devastatingly clear. He described in vivid detail how Karen's presence disrupted critical rescue simulations, how she endangered both the trainees and herself, how she blatantly disregarded multiple warnings and actively interfered with emergency operations. When Karen's lawyer tried to frame the firemen as aggressive or reckless, the chief systematically dismantled every attempt, explaining the safety protocols, the painstaking planning that went into each drill, and the extraordinary patience and professionalism his crew had shown in dealing with an uncooperative civilian. The turning point came when a deputy sheriff testified about Karen's behavior, describing her physical resistance, her false 911 calls, and the unforgettable moment she tried to hijack a fire truck by clinging to a hose reel, screaming that it was her lifeboat. The entire courtroom fought to contain their laughter, and even the judge's mouth twitched once before she swiftly composed herself. When Karen finally took the stand in her own defense, it was an unmitigated disaster. Her story shifted like sand under questioning. First, she insisted she thought it was public parkland. Then, when pressed, she claimed she had received verbal permission from a man she conveniently could not name. Moments later, she changed her story again, suggesting that private property signs had not been clearly visible despite the multiple large warning signs captured plainly in the video evidence. Each falsehood stacked up like a flimsy house of cards, and Lisa dismantled them methodically, leaving Karen sweating under the relentless spotlight. At one point, Karen attempted to muster tears, but they dried up almost instantly under the judge's piercing gaze. After closing arguments, there was no suspense. The judge left the room for only a few minutes before returning with her decision. In a crisp, firm voice, she dismissed Karen's lawsuit with prejudice, meaning Karen could never refile it. She ordered Karen to pay full restitution to the fire department for the cost of rescheduling training, demi for damages, trespassing, and legal fees, and levied an additional fine for filing a malicious lawsuit. But it was the final part of the ruling that truly drove the nail into the coffin. As part of her restitution, Karen was ordered to complete 200 hours of community service, specifically with the fire department she had tried so hard to sue. The courtroom erupted in murmured astonishment and barely hidden laughter. Karen's mouth fell open in horror, her lawyer slumping visibly beside her. Outside the courthouse, the media vultures swarmed, eager for statements. I kept mine short, saying simply that I was grateful justice had been served and the fire department could continue their critical work without further distraction. Lisa, standing beside me like a general surveying a battlefield, offered a razor-sharp comment about the dangers of abusing the legal system for personal gain. Karen, by contrast, shoved her way past the cameras, shielding her face with a manila folder, her once fiery spirit utterly extinguished. Within hours, the story went viral, memes exploded across the internet. TikToks reenacting her disastrous courtroom performance racked up millions of views, and local news stations ran segments gleefully recapping her spectacular downfall. Someone even composed a parody song titled Campfire Karen that played on repeat at local fire stations for weeks. Karen tried a last desperate move, filing an appeal against the decision, but it was half-hearted at best. Her new lawyer barely lasted a week before dropping the case entirely once confronted with the mountain of evidence stacked against her. With her lawsuits dead, her reputation in ruins, and her social media presence obliterated, Karen had no choice left but to report for her court-ordered community service. That final chapter promised to be even more satisfying than anything we had seen so far. The morning Karen was scheduled to report for her court-ordered community service dawned brutally hot and clear, the kind of sweltering summer day that made even seasoned firefighters think twice about wearing full gear. I could not resist the temptation to swing by the station on my way into town, a coffee in hand, and there she was, standing awkwardly among a group of fresh-faced recruits, a living contradiction in her oversized yellow turnout pants and ill-fitting jacket. No amount of official clothing could disguise the sour, defeated expression glued to her face, or the way she crossed her arms stubbornly across her chest like a child refusing to eat vegetables. The fire chief stood in front of the group, back in his usual dusty uniform, sunglasses perched low on his nose, and he spoke with a gleeful edge that was impossible to miss, the energy of a man who had waited a very long time for this moment. Karen tried to keep her distance from the others, avoiding conversation, but it was obvious she stuck out like a sore thumb in a sea of disciplined, hardworking trainees who were there because they actually wanted to be. The chief wasted no time assigning tasks. Karen, naturally, was given the grunt work, the kind of jobs usually reserved for rookies who had yet to earn their stripes. She was handed a mop, a scrub brush, and a bucket of soapy water with clear instructions to clean the fire hoses, wash down the trucks, and scrub the engine bays until they shined like new. It was not glamorous, it was not optional, and it certainly was not the cushy light-duty desk work Karen had no doubt imagined for herself when she heard the words community service. I watched from a distance as she struggled almost immediately, trying to lift a hose nearly as thick as her own arm, the heavy rubber sagging and twisting awkwardly in her hands. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own boots, while the other recruits methodically and efficiently completed their tasks without a word of complaint. Within minutes, sweat was pouring down Karen's forehead, soaking into her hair and leaving dark patches under her jacket. Every few seconds, she would glance around, hoping desperately that someone might come rushing to her aid or offer a reprieve. No one did. If anything, the crew worked harder, pointedly ignoring her flailing efforts. At one point, she tried arguing with a supervising officer, claiming her court order specified light duties only. The officer, a towering woman who looked like she could lift a fire truck with one hand, simply pointed to the judge's instructions taped to the station door, underlined in red ink, all standard training maintenance tasks. No exceptions. Karen's face flushed a brilliant shade of red, matching the fire trucks lined up behind her. It only got better when the day's drills kicked into full gear. The recruits were instructed to practice hose deployment and emergency response, hauling equipment across the training grounds at a dead run, simulating the brutal pace of a real disaster. Karen tried to fake a sudden back injury, clutching dramatically at her lower back and wincing in exaggerated agony, but the fire chief had seen every trick in the book. Without a flicker of sympathy, he handed her a lighter dummy hose and barked for her to move. The sight of Karen stumbling and staggering across the wide-open field, dragging the hose behind her like an anchor while real recruits lapped her twice without breaking a sweat, was almost poetic in its beauty. Adding to her humiliation, a few local news crews had shown up to document her court-mandated service. Cameras caught every miserable second, from her failing at simple hose handling to her collapsing into a puddle of mud and water left over from earlier drills. She lay there for a stunned moment, spread out like a discarded rag doll, before popping up sputtering and furious, screaming about unsafe working conditions and negligence, and vowing to sue again. The fire chief calmly handed her a mop and pointed back toward the puddle she had created. Karen, glaring daggers at everyone within sight, had no choice but to trudge back and start sloshing dirty water around with all the grace of a toddler throwing a tantrum. Over the following weeks, Karen's humiliation became an unofficial tradition around the firehouse. Photos circulated privately of her mopping truck bays, scrubbing toilets, and awkwardly trying to coil hoses with zero skill. Someone even stitched together a short montage video set to circus music, showcasing her greatest fails, and it spread like wildfire through local fire departments. She became a walking cautionary tale, a reminder that while you might bully some people with lawsuits and theatrics, you do not mess with the men and women who run toward danger while everyone else runs away. To her credit, or maybe just her total lack of options, Karen eventually stopped fighting the inevitable. She trudged through her assignments day after miserable day, each step a little slower, her face a little more resigned. The once constant live streams and outraged video rants vanished completely. No more accusations, no more cries of tyranny, just a heavy, embarrassed silence. When her final day of service arrived, the firehouse held a small, informal celebration, not for Karen, of course, but for the recruits who had successfully completed their first month of training. There were cupcakes, sodas, and a lot of jokes about surviving both fires and Karens. Karen said nothing as she finished her last assigned task. She peeled off her loaned uniform jacket, dropped it wordlessly into a collection bin, and shuffled toward the parking lot with her head bowed and her shoulders hunched in defeat. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic exits, no final threats of legal action. Just a battered old minivan sputtering to life and vanishing down the dusty road, carrying her away from a town that had permanently moved on without her. In the weeks that followed, life returned to normal. The fire department completed all their scheduled drills, stronger and more unified than ever. I returned to managing my property, occasionally finding forgotten, scorched scraps of camping gear buried in the weeds, small reminders of the chaos one entitled woman had tried to unleash. Thanks to the judge's restitution order, a small check eventually arrived in the mail from Karen, which Lisa and I immediately donated to a local burn victims fund in her honor. The fire department, with their characteristic humor, officially renamed the training field Karen's Retreat, erecting a handmade wooden sign featuring a cartoon tent engulfed in cheerful flames. Every time I drove past that sign, I could not help but smile. It stood not just as a monument to absurdity, but as a lasting reminder that respect, common sense, and humility still mattered. Karen had thought she could scream her way to victory, that by playing the victim louder and longer than anyone else she would win. Instead, she had written her own downfall with every foolish choice she made, immortalizing herself not as a hero, but as a punchline in a town that now carried on stronger, wiser, and infinitely more amused without her. If there is any justice in the world, it is this. The fire Karen started with her arrogance and entitlement ended not in a courtroom triumph, not with a fat settlement check, but with a mop, a bucket, and the sound of laughter echoing across a sunlit training ground where real heroes prepared to save real lives.